Just a minute here for it to set up. Hi, welcome to North of 48. It's January the 4th, 2025. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. It's about minus 14 here in northern Canada, and we're going to talk about Poland today, a country that used to span all the way up to Sweden and used to own Moscow or Moskva back in the day. A country that had high educational standards through the 1800s, in a country that was decimated by Germany and the Soviet Union, and also with the participation in Ukraine. And what's funny is that Poland is now a proud partner of Ukraine as they're into the 1,048th day of the illegal Russian invasion into Ukraine. And I'm going to be joined by Zem, and he grew up in Poland, and we're going to have a conversation about growing up in Soviet times. Hi, Zem. How are you, sir?
I am doing very well. Yourself?
Oh,
Keeping warm, I hope, in your little abode.
that's always on our mind, trying to keep warm up here. Yeah, so it's come see, come saw. You know what it is. You've been. How's the weather out there where you are? You're out in California, right?
Yeah, I'm in San Jose. Give me just a second and I'll tell you.
Okay. We look forward to hearing that.
So we have plus 14 centigrade.
Wow.
I guess I'm like 28 degrees away from you,
You,
Celsius wise. My God, minus 14, did you say? That is
yes.
amazing.
Well,
Okay.
it is we're a tough people up here, you know. My grandparents came from Warsaw in 1939, and they landed in Halifax. And then Canada had a plan for the farmland where if you could do a quarter section, tree it, it was yours, and you contribute to the economy. And that's how my dad's family came to the country from Poland. So it's fascinating to be able to talk to yourself. So I appreciate it. I have a weird recollection of the money they brought over at the time, all different colors with roosters on it, and things have changed, right? Because I had some Polish money from 1917 and stuff in the house, so I give it away to the grandkids, in a little plaque there. There you go. Don't spend it all in one place, right? So, Zem, you were born in Poland, and
That's right.
you were there till you were about 13, as I understand it, right?
That's right.
What are your memories stretching back? I know now you living in the U.S., you have a different view of things, but back then, growing up in Poland, can you tell us a little bit about what it was like?
Well,
Or
I think some people have the impression that um, the entire Soviet bloc was sort of a prison in a way. Um, as a child, I was always politically exposed. My father listened to Radio for Europe all the time, so I was very well versed in foreign affairs even as a child. I mean, I am sort of a wonk in that aspect, but I have to tell you that Poland was basically benign. In the 70s, Poland was one of the most, if not the most benign Eastern Bloc dictatorships. Now, of course, it was an authoritarian state. There was censorship, right? But for example, one thing you could do if you were Polish is travel to the West quite extensively. And that ties me into your podcast and your latitude, because the first country I visited on vacation, and that country is called Canada.
oh wow,
Um, my father, on several occasions, he is was a professor of computer science, and he always made these trips. He's been to England a couple of times as a lecturer in the late 60s, mid 70s. And in 1978/79, during that academic year, he got a gig at the University of Waterloo, Ontario. Um, and so he invited my mother and myself on vacation, which also tells you about the sort of relative prosperity, right? I mean, we were not prosperous by any stretch of the imagination, but we were also not piss poor, right? We could afford a round trip ticket to Montreal and then on Air Canada to Toronto.
Wow.
I have very fond memories. See, Canada is the first foreign slash Western country that I've seen that I saw in my life, and it has become a reference point for me
Wow.
as the first country that I saw. 2 years later, I moved to suburban Detroit. My father got a gig at this uh, really shitty college called Oakland University in suburban Detroit. And when you do this, you involuntarily compare your this new homeland, the US, with Canada. And the comparison was usually unfavorable. You know, many years later, I remember George H.W. Bush pleading with Americans to make a kinder, gentler America. And I always thought, well, there is such a place already. It's called Canada. You know, I have because you know, maybe I'm over exaggerating it. I'm sure many countries have their weirdnesses. I was only there for a month, but it's basically a reference point for me. But I'm bringing this in to illustrate the fact that I as a child, 11-year-old child, and my mother could get a passport, could get a visa, hop on a plane. It was an Ilyushin 62. It was not a, you know, it was a Soviet-built plane, but still, we made it to Gander to refuel. Then we went on to Montreal, you know, and we could do this in the People's, you know, Republic of Poland in 1979, you know. So it is not sort of a barbed wire, you know, North Korea type situation. I think North Korea would be sort of the opposite of People of Poland in many ways. So it's not, um, it was not, you know, as terrible as some people might imagine. Definitely not in the 70s. Um, Back then, Poland joined the International Monetary Fund, which apparently Gierek had to sort of convince Brezhnev to allow him to do this because the IMF is a U.S., it's an American post-World War II Bretton Woods institution, right? The IMF and the World Bank to, you know, designed to create stability to sort of forestall further communist expansion, right? And here's the People's Republic of Poland joining this thing, right? And at some point, um, the leader at the time said to, I think it was Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, the French president, that Poland had no political prisoners. And in the mid 70s, that was correct. After the Helsinki Accords, which was, I think, 75, what would happen is they would, you know, arrest some people and then release them after 48 hours. So it was harassment, definitely, but they were not, you know, they sort of played along with this whole Helsinki model, you know. So they harassed them to the extent that they could, but then basically they left things alone, you know. Um, and so Solidarność, when that came around in 1980, it was actually a culmination of the improvement of conditions, not the worsening. I think Henry Kissinger made that observation that, you know, rebellion or any sort of revolution occurs when conditions improve, not when they worsen, because people then have a sort of an appetite, you know, the hunger then grows, right? As you become more prosperous and you see, you know, how the other half lives. Like for instance, Poland always had a ton of American television shows for
Oh,
as
really?
long as I can remember, a ton of American movies. I saw Star Wars as a child in Poland in the Polish movie theater, which was actually interesting that the communists would allow this, thinking in retrospect, because it showed you things that you were probably better off not seeing. You know, I think it kind of struck, you know, a nerve with a lot of people, even
Yeah,
those who had actually visited somewhere.
it's,
So it was a really bizarre
especially
place.
especially going against the Empire, right?
Yeah.
Star Wars.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
when Czechoslovakia got invaded, where do you have memories of that in
No,
Poland?
I was actually born in 1968, so I would be like probably the Prague Spring and the aftermath. I was like 5 months, so
Oh, okay.
no memories of that. Yeah.
All right. All right. Well, how were goods and stuff like butter and bread and stuff? Was that plentiful? Yeah.
It,
Wasn't like in Russia itself?
you know, I have to actually differentiate that as a function of time. In the mid 70s, you could actually get everything you needed. There was always a problem with meat, and
Mm,
people would queue up for meat. You know, of course, there were always glitches in the communist economy because supply and demand could not be aligned because they had no free, you know, free prices or a free market.
right.
Um, so there were certain goods that you could not get. So meat, that was always a huge line if you wanted to get whatever, a piece of pork. Later, they introduced ration cards. I remember having them in the late 80s where you were entitled to, 500 grams of pork with bone or without bone. I remember just these different categorizations, which were funny. I remember also in the late 70s, they introduced rationing for sugar. You also had little cards, that entitled you to purchase some amount of sugar. Um, as the 70s progressed, things got gradually worse because the Polish economy was basically teetering on the verge of collapse. What Gierek was the communist guy who ran Poland did after they joined the IMF, they borrowed something in the order of $40 billion, $1970,
Right.
for all sorts of economic development. And some of this you could see in terms of like for instance, housing construction. It boomed quite a lot. If you went to a big city like Warsaw, you would see tons of cranes everywhere. They were building things, at least during that period, because they had this capital that they borrowed and later couldn't pay back. Uh, so, things got progressively worse. And when I came to the States, it was mid 1981. I left in June of 1981. My father was already here in Detroit. He started in 1980. And of course, he was freaking out because Soviet troops were actually surrounding Poland at that point. And, they had satellite imagery, right? That the Soviets would go in. And, later I read different historical debates that the Soviets actually didn't want to because Afghanistan was more than enough for them to chew, probably more than they could chew in historical perspective. That was the case. But there were definitely, these satellite images, and he was freaking out. In 1980 and 81, the economy went into a free fall. I remember standing in a long line for butter at
Okay.
a grocery store, my local grocery store, and I noticed they delivered it in these cartons. And on the cartons, I was studying English a little bit at the time. It said "product of New Zealand."
Ah,
So those were gifts. They were, foodstuffs that were donated to People's Poland during that time because you had Solidarność. I remember IBM donating a bunch of like typewriters to the Solidarność Labor Union. So we had a lot of stuff coming in like that, but it was pretty pathetic that here we are, a country that was sort of industrialized in many respects, right?
yeah.
And we could not produce butter. So in 81 and towards December when martial law was declared, uh, everything was really in a free fall because the dollar, the US dollar stream dried up instantaneously, because they discovered that the emperor really has no clothes on. I think in the 70s, some Citibank executive said that countries can never go bankrupt. Can you imagine the stupidity that we had as a human species? In the 70s, someone like that would say countries can go bankrupt. I think America will go bankrupt in about 20 years. It's definitely possible. So yeah, that I do remember. It was actually quite dramatic at that point.
Going to school though, there must have been some doctrine from the Soviets. Well, it sounds like you had access to the free press, to various American movies and stuff. But in school itself, was there indoctrination at all about the Soviet system, or
None. None.
really?
I mean, starting in fifth grade, we had to study Russian. So I
You
studied
you didn't
Russian.
have to put on a military uniform every morning and go to school? No.
No, I was actually a Cub Scout as a little boy, and we went around, orienteering, whatever Cub Scouts do. I don't recall for 1 minute being told about the virtues of Marxism, Leninism. Which, by the way, I still don't know what that means. If you turn on the television set, of course, you heard speeches by Communist Party officials
Right.
about Marxism, Leninism. I realized much later in life that no one actually defined this for me. I don't know what it is. I know that it's good and people talk about it a lot, but what is it? It's kind of like separation of church and state in America, which really doesn't exist. And you can tell because Americans talk about it a lot. If you talk about it too much, then the lady doth protest too much, right? And you know that something is off. But no, as a child, I really don't recall this. And now if you go into high school, I don't know what changed there. I think I met a friend of mine later, and he said he had some sort of social studies stuff type thing where they were discussing American hegemony.
Okay.
Which I guess, these days you could go to UC Berkeley and get the same thing, probably even worse.
Right.
So there was some indoctrination, but nothing, nothing sort of out of the, nothing cosmic or unimaginable. So as a child, no, there was the official television. Of course, there was press, which again had the reputation of being relatively free. Relatively speaking, there was censorship, but apparently Polish press could get away with printing something that you would not read in the Soviet press or the East German press, for example, right? Poland always had this sort of political chaos to it, whereas Hungary was known for economic development. Hungary had a private sector. They were sort of most developed in that way. I think in terms of political freedom, and again, I'm using quotation marks, the People's Republic of Poland was fairly open because Poles are actually a very sort of anarchistic people when you think about it.
Yeah, well,
They're very difficult to
knowing
govern.
Polish people, there's a thing such as Polish oppositional defiance. The
Correct,
sky's
correct,
blue. No, it's green.
correct, 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 correct. And many Americans confuse that with the Polish yearning for freedom. No, it's not freedom, it's just stubbornness. We're stubborn as mules, and we're difficult to govern by anyone who tried, the Prussians, the Russians, the Austrians. The Poles themselves barely govern themselves, because we are sort of very obstreperous kind of a culture, right? So
Right.
communists really had a difficulty. I mean, they never nationalized farming, for example. They never collectivized farming. They
You
tried
mean
and
that the farming was private? I mean,
correct.
you could own your own land in Soviet Poland?
Correct. It was actually a division between Eastern Poland, which used to be Poland before the war, and Western Poland, which was taken from the Germans. In Western Poland, you did have more collective farming because there were no farmers pre-existing on that land, right? They were resettled from what today's Belarus or Western Ukraine, right?
Right.
So they didn't have attachment to that land. But in Eastern Poland, absolutely. It was private. And of course, the other institution they couldn't get rid of was the Roman Catholic Church, right?
Right.
They
Which
also
which played
tried,
a
and
great part in the 80s, that's for
yeah,
sure.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So there are limits to what even the communist government could do without really encountering opposition that was probably not worth the candle for them to fight.
Right. Wow, that is amazing. That's actually part of the history I did not know. So, and the Western, yeah, which was so there was a lot of Germans, I think, in the west part, right?
Well, they were
After the war.
all resettled. I mean,
Yeah,
it was part of Germany, right? Part of the Third
right,
Reich, and that was Joseph Stalin took that away. He took the eastern part of Poland and gave Poland the western, what used to be Germany, right?
right.
And yeah, they were resettled. There was a massive resettlement operation that went on in the late 40s, um, which it's not talked about, and there is sort of a murmur that this was traumatic for the Germans themselves, the German population that had to be uprooted and moved to, I don't know if they went to East Germany or West Germany, and people really don't like talking about it because they started it, quote unquote, right? That this
Right.
event was a chain reaction started by Hitler in 1939, and they was sort of it triggered this chain of events which led to their loss of this land, right? And
Right.
they're them being expelled. But on a human level, and some people in Poland point us out, those are two orthogonal things. We can obviously hate the Third Reich, but individual human beings still have experiences, right? And they can be traumatic, even if you are German, right? So
Right.
there's the separation that needs to happen. So no, they were not, I mean, I had family actually who moved to Western Poland to a town called Pyrzyce, which is about 20 kilometers from the present German border. But
Okay.
before the war, it was Germany, right? But and the Germans were all resettled. So no, I didn't see any particular minorities in Poland that I remember, which is very different from today, which is really interesting. It has really changed, and it has become a more world-oriented country, definitely than before. So that's one of the aspects I don't recognize, although I'm happy that I don't recognize it. I think it's a good thing. Diversity is very good,
Well,
in
okay.
my
No,
opinion.
yeah, it was very, very homogenous country at one time, right?
Mhm.
It's just
Well, before the war, I mean,
yeah,
Warsaw was one-third Jewish. Łódź, was a textile city west of Warsaw, was half Jewish, and Lublin, which is in the southeast, was I think two-thirds Jewish. I mean, Poland had the largest Jewish population,
yeah,
because, if I recall correctly, Poland was the one place in the Middle Ages that Jews could move to and not be persecuted,
it's
right?
true. Yeah.
right? And so, apparently after the war, if you went to the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, you could hear Polish being spoken.
Oh, yeah.
Because I mean, Menachem Begin was from Poland. A lot of people were it's Holocaust survivors, basically.
Yeah.
Oh,
Well,
by the way, you know whose parents were Holocaust survivors? Geddy Lee.
yes, Geddy Lee. Yeah, that's right, from Rush.
Yeah, a few years ago I was watching the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction, and
Right.
took them like 20, 30 years to induct Rush. I do not understand. They're Canada's
It's a
greatest
travesty,
export.
Zem.
And they all were wearing, under lapels, the three of them, they were wearing Stars of David. And I was like, that's just so interesting. I did not know that. Now I'm thinking, okay, that's why they're so, intelligent. Their lyrics are just so, so profound. I have this sort of weird philo-Semitic angle, which is also a bit weird, maybe. I'm
Well,
at, one thing I never saw in Poland, and this is, you might surprise you because it was common, anti-Semitism. I never encountered it in childhood. My parents were not anti-Semitic. I mean, they're horrible people in many respects, but they were not anti-Semitic. And
mhm.
I came to the States and I started meeting Jewish people telling me how anti-Semitic Polish people are. And I was honestly genuinely surprised. In the late 80s, I moved back to Poland and okay. Now I see where you're getting this. Yeah, there are anti-Semites in Poland. I was just lucky not to interact with them. You know,
Right.
there's
Well, it was the
but
Jewish Polish freedom fighters that actually helped create the state of Israel.
correct. Yes.
They were trained in Poland and went to Israel, and some of them wanted to come back when the Germans came, and the government said, "No, just stay there, do your thing." As far well, I don't know how much the
I don't know. I
government
mean, there
was
was
involved.
yeah, after, the Soviets made up with Poland after Hitler attacked during Barbarossa, right? They had this
Right.
section of the Polish army called the Anders Army. Anders is the name of the general. And they actually went through the Soviet Union, through Iran, through Levant, through Israel, and then they went to Italy, where they fought on the Italian front with the Allies. A lot of these people were Jewish, including Menachem Begin, who stayed in Palestine. So
Okay.
some of the Jewish Poles stayed in Palestine. Uh, and that was the route that some of them took. I'm sure after the war, some went to resettlement camps in Germany of all places, and then they moved to either the United States or to Israel. Uh, Later in 1968, there was a really ugly, um, I don't know how to describe it, a purge of Jewish intellectuals, Jewish party members, Jewish professors. It was not a violent thing in any way. They were basically given one-way passports out of the country to leave. It was really an internal struggle within the Polish Communist Party, which actually repeated itself throughout the Eastern Bloc. That was like the more educated part, the Jewish part, the part that was people who were trained in the Comintern, which was this sort of this communist academy in Moscow that the Soviets set up. And then there was sort of the indigenous communists, the underground Polish communists, which tended to be more ethnically just Polish, Slavic, right? And the reason for the difference is because the literacy rate among Jewish Poles was far higher. I mean, statistically, the difference was huge. So they became sort of part of the administration after the war because they were simply more capable of actually just running the place, and that fed into the anti-Semitism, as you might imagine. So communism and cosmopolitanism and anti-Semitism sort of mixed together, right? The evil communists were the Jews, and the Jews were the evil communists, and it kind of blew up in 1968, and it was an internal um, sort of fratricide within the Communist Party. It was not like people were going around, killing Jews. In 1948, I'm jumping around. Please stop me at any point, but my mind kind
Oh
of
no,
wanders.
you go ahead. I am just fascinated, Zem.
Yeah. In
Some insight that
1948,
would
there
be
was this
helpful.
pogrom in the town of Kielce, and that was a real pogrom, where there were still Jews. Um, and it was just absolutely horrible. It's a horrible stain on Polish history. Later, people made excuses. Oh, it was the Communist Secret Service that sort of goaded these people to do it, because it was a debate at that point whether Poland would be extended the Marshall Plan, which of course Stalin rejected, and for very good reasons. Actually, I think for his evil good reasons. That's what I mean. And, that would, make Paul fall under the sort of Western influence in some way, which was, of course, unacceptable. And this program, I guess was meant to dissuade people from pushing this because Poland was really not civilized, and murdered Jews, and that was really a horrible thing. To my knowledge, it was not really replicated. I do not know of any other pogroms um, at the time, which doesn't mean they didn't happen, but I do like historical facts instead of uh, um, assumptions that some people may
Right.
make.
Yeah.
Um, and Walter, I have to apologize. I do lose my train of thought sometimes, and
I
I
so
just I just
so do
you
I,
know
and I'm just
yeah.
fascinated by that kind of inside baseball things I did not know about Poland. So no, I appreciate it very much. Okay, so you moved to the States, and I'll get back to your childhood in a minute here. But then you moved back to Poland
Correct.
in the
I,
80s,
I
was it?
was I was in the late 80s. I was really struggling with depression, and I still am. Currently, I'm fairly well medicated. That's why I'm on disability, by the way, Social Security disability. That's my story. And I really hated America. I could not really fit in. I couldn't make any friends, and later turned out I couldn't make friends anywhere. But I
Uh-oh.
moved to Poland in 1987. And at that point, of course, I had my memories of Poland from 1981, and I assumed, oh my God, I'll go back and there'll be empty shelves everywhere.
Right.
But no, no. I mean, not that the country was super prosperous, but you didn't have shortages of butter, for example, or people queuing up for stuff like that. Meat, I think you still had to queue up. I don't know what the problem there was with maybe the individual farmers. I never could figure out why that particular foodstuff was difficult sort of to produce and to deliver. But no, and the other thing I remember is that the propaganda mechanism of the country changed. In the 70s, they had something called the propaganda of success, how wonderful everything was. So every newscast began that the first secretary of the Communist Party, Edvard Gerek, visited some factory that made, for instance, canned tuna, right? And you saw this, assembly line with these tuna cans running around. One comedian actually made fun of this and says, "Well, this is a very good thing that they showed it because that was the last time you would see these cans of tuna." Right, because they were actually hard to come by. A lot of them were exported to the West to make at least some foreign currency. So, there were jokes about this, right? But there was this propaganda of success. Everything is wonderful. In the 80s, people basically bitched all the time. How, there isn't enough bread, the buses are late, things are dirty. The one thing you could not question is the leading role of the Communist Party and, of course, our fraternal friendship with the USSR. Those two were sacred. However, day-to-day um, you know, things happening in the country, we're open to criticism. I found it very interesting. So they really changed the way they approached it. And it was still propaganda. I remember in 1987, there was this horrible plane crash in Warsaw, the biggest tragedy in civil aviation. It took them 2 days to report on the news. Now, I listened to the Voice of America. I listened to Radio Free Europe. I knew exactly what happened, how many people perished. It took them 2 days to actually figure out how to even report it. So there you had communist propaganda and control of information, right? But it was by omission, not commission. They didn't tell you stupid shit about tuna cans or how, industrial production is wonderful. That was gone. It was a slightly different flavor of propaganda. And I must say I was impressed in a sort of kind of an evil way that this is actually more subtle and more effective because the 70s thing was just so blatantly obvious that I think it probably was counterproductive because it was just so counter to reality that you immediately discounted it. Whereas here, yeah, people bitched about, dirty buses or dirty trains or this or that and the other, and it was open season.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, religion in Poland played a paramount, was in a paramount position in Poland, right?
Mhm.
So was there a clash between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church in Poland? Were there, do you recall, like
I do not
Christmas,
even
was it on
recall.
the 25th of December or was it on the 7th
I
of
do not
January?
even recall, and this is probably my ignorance because
No,
I
no,
lived sort
no,
of
no.
in Gdańsk, which was sort of, well, before the war, it was basically a German town, and the Germans were settled, and then that's
Okay,
where my parents moved. I don't know, in Eastern Poland, maybe they had some Orthodox churches, but I'm actually not aware.
okay.
Uh, I'm not aware of any conflict between the Roman Catholic Church and other faiths. There was always, something bubbling under the surface. I remember Jehovah's Witnesses visiting us in the 70s. Uh, I later learned that Jehovah's Witnesses were actually an American invention, which makes sense, just like the Mormons, because they have a strong marketing arm. Americans are good at marketing. So you had now apparently the Mormon church is making inroads in Poland, that those are the guys who came in, I'll give you brochures, written in Polish, but then you looked at the paper, at the print, at the ink, and you said, no, this is not printed in Poland. This, I mean, it just doesn't look like a piece of paper that like a Polish press would print anywhere. This was American materials shipped to Poland in Polish. And you know, they had their reputation of being nicer people, maybe not as rude. I must say, even today, I find Polish people to be relatively rude. Maybe because I live in the States, although of course Canadians are the opposite extreme, and Californians are probably somewhere in the middle there. But um, yeah, so in terms of sectarian tensions, I really don't recall any.
Really?
The
Okay.
interplay between the communist government and the church is more interesting, how that evolved over time.
Oh
Uh,
yeah, yeah. And
uh,
especially you were there in the 80s when all heck broke loose there.
well, actually, see,
Right.
this is another thing that actually the communists did wisely. Not that I am a communist or a communist sympathizer, but I have to admit that there is such a thing as statecraft, right, as governing. So in the 70s, for instance, the communist government, basically had two adversaries: the Roman Catholic Church and sort of the working class, where you had things bubbling up. There were actually strikes in 1976, um, after the government raised prices on some things. Interestingly enough, the government backed down and reversed the price increases, which tells you that there was a certain limit to which the communists could actually push the country. And of course, the church was sort of harangued in the way they were not given permits to build churches, for example. Often, you heard stories about churches being built at night, that people would come up, drive up in their cars, turn on their headlights, and build whatever they could, because later the communists would have a difficult time sort of tearing them down. You know, so the church, did have was harassed by the communists, definitely.
That's
Uh,
that Polish oppositional defiance syndrome right there.
I suppose, but here's
We're
what
going to
happened
build
in
a
the
church at
80s,
night.
after martial law. In the 80s, the church could build as many churches as it wanted.
Oh, okay.
The communists basically chose their battles. They said, okay, so the Solidarność we're going to repress, we're going to intern all these activists, Wałęsa and Lis and everybody else. The Polish church, we will tolerate now. We will not um, harass. And, this is, divide et impera, right? Divide and rule. And it
Right.
was successful. The church really disconnected itself from, sort of the woes of the Polish working class. To them, sort of martial law was not as serious as it was for the ordinary Pole, which shows you what the Roman Catholic Church was and is to this day. Like
Right.
their stance on abortion these days. I mean, again, I don't want to proselytize. Well, there's, I guess, just one more person online. I'm, as I said to you earlier, an atheist, and I do not like institutional churches. I can tolerate individual religiosity and spirituality. If you go to church, if you believe in God, I do respect that. But in church as an institution, I mean, to me, the Roman Catholic Church is the world's oldest and most successful multinational corporation.
Is it
Enjoys-
marketing maybe?
Yes, it enjoys tax breaks that all other corporations would only dream of. You
True.
know, Microsoft doesn't get this, GM, no, they have to pay taxes actually, and they have to dodge taxes and do stuff, right? The
Right.
Roman Catholic Church is very effective. It hit, pedophiles for centuries, people who really harmed children, in their
Yes.
parishes. Okay, I'll stop because now I'm ranting. But anyway, the communists did this divide and rule thing very effectively,
Right.
very effectively. And also in the 80s, 1987, things began to, the wheels began to come off already, because this was, I think, a year after Chernobyl. It was, I think, 2 years after Gorbachev came to power, and that's when things started to unravel already. In 1987, you could obtain and install a satellite dish in your
Oh,
home. And you
wow.
could watch, the worst that, Rupert Murdoch had to offer, which was Sky News, with the
Right.
British thing, BSB. And it was legal, and it gradually changed. Like at some point, they start jamming Radio for Europe. It was always jammed later I learned that the Polish government had to actually pay the Soviets to do it. It was Soviet equipment that did it, and they had actually to pay. So there was this element of commerce in there, which I find kind of amusing. That stopped. Then you could get modems. Then in like 87, 88, you could see independent publications sprouting up, which were sort of cultural in nature, but still kind of, kind of edgy, not anti-communists. And then, of course, we had the Round Table Accords. The Polish thing was very gradual. It was very gradual, and I lived through it. In 1988, we had strikes in colleges. I was at the university there. We had like an occupation strike. Nothing happened to us. We were not shot at or arrested or any of that, right? It lasted several weeks, then we left. The shipyard, I remember, was surrounded by um, the ZOMO, the militarized police.
Right.
So that actually looked pretty frightening, but there was no breach of the gate like in 1970, for example. There was no violence, and it ended. So you could tell you were dealing with a different regime than
Right.
before because Gorby was in power, and I later read history books just how quickly it became to unravel because the Soviets were sending signals almost from the get-go saying, "We will support you ideologically." You are communists, we're communists, we will support you ideologically. But that's all we can do because our economy is in free fall. I mean, the Soviet economy, if you think the Polish economy was bad, they were
Right.
completely in free fall. And they actually said as much to the Poles. In other words, military intervention at that point was probably impossible for economic reasons.
Yeah.
The Soviets were just too broke to even, project their power in the ways that they, might have been tempted to in decades past, right? So
Right.
it really unraveled very quickly. And I often, I meet Americans who have sort of the CNN understanding, people standing on the Berlin Wall. Oh my goodness, by that point in Poland, we had presidential elections, we had a free parliament. Solidarność was legalized like a year and a half before, and it was gradual. It was very gradual. In 1988, they had a debate on television between Lech Wałęsa and Alfred Miodowicz, who was the head of the nominally independent but communist created trade unions. And it was
Okay.
a real debate that they had. That was the first time I think Polish television showed Wałęsa. I don't remember seeing him in 80 and 81. They were very careful, actually, not even to mention the word Solidarność, even though they had 10 million members in a country of 35 million. You know,
Yeah.
in 1988, they showed him for the first time. No, I take it back. The first time they showed it, I think, was a year earlier when they showed the Michael Jackson video, "Man in the Mirror."
You
And it
guys
had a
got
bunch
Michael
of people.
Jackson
It
in
had
Poland.
Nelson Mandela, it had all these people, and it had Wałęsa for like 2 seconds. And I was kind of surprised at the time that they would show it, but it was Michael Jackson, so they had to show it. So it's like the
Right.
weirdest things through which how information enters, through the weirdest channels. But it was gradual. It was very gradual. To me, it was not a revolution at all. It was actually very civilized, very evolved. There was no violence. I mean, Romania actually was probably the only country where you actually had violent confrontations, as it
Well,
imploded.
it just goes to show that the Polish people are highly civilized, right?
I'll go along with that. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
okay. Were you
No,
there when the Pope came to town?
I was there in 19, actually, no, I was there in 1979. I was still in elementary school. I remember it was broadcast live on TV, him landing at the airport, being greeted by the communists. Nobody went to school on that day. I mean, we had a class of about 36 people. So I think three people showed up on that day. I was at home watching it, as was everybody else.
Right.
Um, in 1987, when I was back, I did see him live and in concert. He came to Gdańsk and he gave a sermon. And I remember we took this bus from where I lived to Gdańsk. It was actually this place called Westerplatte, which is where World War II actually started. And it's like a monument there, and that's where he gave a sermon. And I remember driving jump this road towards Westerplatte, and in the other direction, I saw a column, a long row of riot gear, police, like, trucks with water cans, everything. I mean, it was huge. I guess they really wanted to demonstrate, their might at this point. Nothing ever happened later. I mean, there weren't any clashes, but I never even saw it on television during martial law. This much armored vehicles.
Right.
The next time I saw an armored vehicle on the street was in 2016 in San Jose during the Trump visit. The San Jose police actually parked an armored vehicle. I thought it was like in Poland in 1982 or something. And later they did have skirmishes on the street in San Jose in 2016, right?
Wow.
So, yeah, yeah. I'm jumping around. I'm sorry.
No, no,
So
I
I
appreciate
saw
it.
him live, and I'm not I was never really a believer. So to me, it was more of a political event than a religious one. You know, um,
Yeah, but to the Polish people, it must have been a symbol of more freedom. I mean, you still had the union and you still had the government at odds with each other, right?
yeah,
Uh,
yeah. I mean, so
and
that was still illegal. Yeah, yeah.
right, so oh, geez, that's just amazing. The uh, the actual fall of USSR, when they took the vote and Poland became its own country again. Do you recall much about that at all?
Well,
Because
yeah. I mean, in
was that
1980, I mean,
91, 90?
always were. We were always a separate country. We had a separate currency, constitution, legal. We had something called limited sovereignty, which is sort of Brezhnev's phrase. But we were a country. We're not a Soviet republic like
Right.
Estonia, or right. We were a separate country. I mean, at least formally. So that wasn't it. I remember voting in the elections on June 4th, 1989, which was the same day that the Tiananmen Square massacre occurred. I mean, it's sort of very symbolic that these two events would happen concurrently. I remember voting. I was actually working at Solidarność at the time, and it was pretty interesting. The campaign was interesting because it was the first time that anybody ran a campaign uh, from the opposition, but also the communists. I mean, in a authoritarian system, you don't have campaigns, you don't have elections, right? And I remember being in Warsaw, and suddenly I see this open bed truck with the banner Solidarność, on the side, and they were in the truck. There was a band playing Dixieland jazz, and they were just driving down the street, with the Solidarność. I mean, some things you see in Poland are just so random. They had this great poster that said June 4th, 1989, high noon. Gary Cooper. If you want, I can upload you the poster. It was like Gary Cooper from the Western High Noon. And it said High Noon. I mean, it was just brilliant. And I don't know who did it. Polish people are not good at marketing. They're the opposite of Americans. They can't sell a dollar for 50 cents, I think. They have much more to offer than they think they do. But this was brilliant. I was like, oh my God, this is so good. So it was very interesting. I remember H.W. Bush coming to Poland, which was later in '89, I think, like maybe a month later. He was also at Gdańsk. I remember the motorcade. He would at some point stop and like start greeting the people because the streets were just packed. You know, they were packed. I heard the story that if you were in elementary school or high school and you had the misfortune of going to school along the road from Warsaw Airport downtown, you were always chased out where some communist dictator would drive by. So if Brezhnev appeared, you would be chased out to stand on the side of the road. And, here there was no chasing. People voluntarily went to see, George H.W. Bush, who was the savior, right? Um, and yeah, very, very interesting. Very interesting.
Okay. Well, the vote happens to with the dissolution of the USSR. Was there any? It sounds like it was. Was there any celebration in Poland, or they just took it in stride that the USSR had dissolved?
Gosh. See, by 1991, I was back here. I was actually here at Stanford, where I transferred into. Um, there was this period where, the USSR lasted until December of 1991, right? That's when it dissolved. In August of that year, there was this attempted coup, right? Which frightened
Yes.
the hell out of everybody. Wałęsa later claimed, oh, we were like this close to joining NATO at that point because there was a sudden reversal was possible, right?
Right.
Soviet troops didn't leave until like 1992 at some point because there was a whole negotiation. They had to, empty out their bases. They had a significant presence. I guess they had 4 divisions. Also, fun fact, in my childhood in Poland, I saw exactly one Soviet soldier, one, and one Soviet vehicle. They did not make themselves, visible. Yeah, because they were not really welcome and they knew it. I mean, they were not really pushing the envelope too much, right? They were there.
Right.
Everybody knew that they were there. Uh, um, I lost my train of thought again. I'm a bad podcast guest. I
Oh
apologize.
yeah, you're a wonderful guest and a friend of the podcast, so I appreciate it. So we were just talking about the dissolution. So were your parents still alive? Did they have any comments or any of your family?
Well, my parents were divorced at that point. My mother was and still is in Poland. My father remained in Michigan. He's still alive, but barely. Um, so they basically divorced, and they hadn't spoken for 35 years until like last year, which is just
Oh,
bizarre.
good. That's
Yeah,
wonderful.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Were there any comments from the family
Well,
about
no,
Russia?
we were, obviously we were very happy that things were going like this. There was always this tinge of everybody was repeating this Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times, right?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, I remember the
Also
hyperinflation.
known as a Polish proverb, by the way.
I thought it was Chinese. I'd never
It
heard.
is Chinese. It is Chinese, but I think the Polish took it as well. So,
Maybe. Yeah, I remember
yeah.
the hyperinflation definitely in like 1990. I mean, it was crazy. I was working at the time at Solidarność, and my salary just grew, which meant nothing. It meant absolutely nothing. I made, I think, about $35 US per month. If you took the money I made and used the black market conversion rate
Right.
from zlotys to dollars, I was making 35 bucks a month.
Hmm.
My mother, an ophthalmologist, I think, was making a little bit more, but not very much. It
Wow.
was it was absurd. I mean, it was just absurd.
Right.
That one, that's the one thing they had to actually get a handle on when this guy Balcerovich, the finance minister, came in, and they succeeded in squashing inflation. Then they changed the currency over. I think 2 years later, they cut three zeros basically out of it, and that's the currency they still have. So yeah, it was nuts. It was nuts, but it was all peaceful. It was
Right.
it was uh, because I mean that's the other observation I had when I came back in '87, that this is an authoritarian country tinged with anarchy. I don't know how to describe this. We had a dog, a beautiful Cocker Spaniel in the States that we decided to bring to Poland, right? So when we were still there, we contacted the consulate in Chicago and said, okay, what do we need to do? Well, you need to, quarantine, give him the vaccination, and then we did. We had all this paperwork and we show up at the airport in Warsaw, and we show it to the customs lady, and she gives us this blank look and she says, what is this? Does your dog bark in English? I mean, it's just, I mean, to her, it was absurd. Why would we even present her with this paperwork?
Right.
It's a dog on a leash. I mean,
It's a
and
dog.
it
Yeah.
doesn't care. Um, I later learned in 1983 when Miles Davis came to Poland to give a concert, which,
Well,
by
that
the way,
must
he
have been
talks
nice.
about in his, they waved him to the airport, basically. I mean, it was like, and everybody had buttons, including the customs people that said, we want Miles. Somebody made those buttons and everybody had them and they just basically walked right through. You know,
Right.
I mean, Poland is crazy. And when he got there, he had a limo. He was driven around in a limo, which was, I think, the only time in his life that this happened, because jazz musicians are not very well respected in the US, certainly. I don't know
Right.
about Canada. In Europe, they're worshipped, especially Eastern Europe. I saw his concert in 1988. Miles Davis gave a concert, and I still remember it. It was out of this
Well,
world.
we're home to Oscar Peterson and the Tommy Banks Orchestra, and we've
That's
got
right.
some jazz here.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah, yeah.
we do.
Um,
Geez, that must have been
so
amazing.
it's there are these elements where it's like, the U.S. was more orderly, you know,
Yeah.
in many ways. I remember having this really bizarre experience, and you'll laugh at me at this. I was visiting my aunt who lived about 200 kilometers from Gdańsk, and I wanted to take the train. And I made it to the station very late. People were already boarding. So what you can do in Poland, at least, maybe via rail as well, I flagged the conductor and said, "Okay, I'm boarding the train. Come and sell me the ticket." And then I would have to pay a surcharge, right? So I get on the train. The train goes from stations. I reach Gdańsk. I get off the train, no conductor to be seen. I paid nothing. You know what my instinct said? Go to the train station and buy a ticket. I didn't do it. And when I told people later, they laughed at me. Said, "You got to be fucking kidding me. This is like a state railway. Who cares, if you buy tickets. But that was my,
Mhm.
5-year-old Michigan mentality, that you buy tickets to, you know, ride on a railway or bus or whatever. And here I
Right.
was, that's what Poland was like. It was like this, car with the wheels coming off all the time. It was nominally communist, and the official doctrine was there, but if you looked around it every day, it was like a failed Latin American state of some sort. I don't know how to describe it. I visited Nicaragua many years later, and it reminded me of Poland. It was kind of
Oh,
just
really?
everything was kind of tentative. I really don't know how to describe it correctly, but yeah,
Well, just to drift back for a second, Warsaw was pretty well completely demolished during the Second World War, right? And
yeah.
you were saying you've seen nothing but cranes and a lot of
In the
construction.
70s, there was a lot of construction. Although I remember in 19, as late as the 1980s, you could still find houses like brownstones with puck marks from bullets in them. Uh,
Wow.
yeah, you could see it, but it was very rare, you know.
The Jewish enclave in Warsaw, was that completely demolished, or was parts of the ghetto still there where you could see where they were a memorial or anything?
Last
Do you
time I
recall?
was in Warsaw, I didn't see anything. I was actually frankly disappointed.
Yeah.
Um, there was, I don't know if you remember seeing the movie or reading the book, The Pianist, that Polanski made about this. I think his name was Spielman. He's re a real life musician. After the war, he actually composed a bunch of stuff in Poland. And there was a scene where they're building this wooden bridge across the road because the road was for Gentiles, right? And the ghetto was sort of separated. And so they built this wooden bridge. And I remember walking along once, and there's this sign that says, here is, Tubua Kładka. Here's where the bridge was. And it was just a sign. It had no picture of it or anything. I knew what it was because I read the book and I saw the movie, right? But to anyone walking by, this was completely nondescript. I'm a bit disappointed, frankly. It is not as visible. I know they have a Jewish museum now in Warsaw
Mhm.
that I haven't had the luck yet to go to. I plan to do so before I die. But I think they should always have a mark on every street. This is where the ghetto began. I mean, that was just one of the more
Yeah.
horrific, chapters of human history,
Yeah.
and you don't see it as much as I think you should. That's just my
Yeah.
personal opinion.
Well, going back today, what are your thoughts on the government of Poland? Quite authoritative is what I heard, but also uh, arming themselves to the teeth. Like Poland is a major military player in Europe right now, and their thought is that if Russia gets a hold of Ukraine, they're going to have to defend, and they're good friends to Ukraine now. I know there was a lot of animosity. I
Oh,
don't
yeah.
know. Did you have animosity growing up with the Ukrainians or
No.
no?
That's another thing my parents told me, who are, as I said, evil. But one thing they did tell me, we listened to Radio for Europe and all these things, and they would always make a distinction saying the Soviet Union is evil, but the Russian people are not. They
Oh,
always taught me this difference between the state, right, and
right.
the people who come to live there. So yeah, I mean, there were these partisan groups, like there was this guy Bandera who led this sort
Oh,
of
yeah,
fascist.
yeah, yeah.
And the war in Poland actually didn't end until maybe 1947. And in the southeast, there were still skirmishes between the Ukrainians and the Poles for like
Mm,
2 years after the war. No, it completely changed, and it shows you that it's now that we're on the same side. Obviously, we share the same adversary, if not enemy. Well, for
right.
the Ukrainians, it is the enemy, no question about it. You know, uh, um, I mean, we're very welcoming. My mother had a Ukrainian lady. Actually, my mother's pretty elderly by now, and she had a Ukrainian lady come in and cook and clean, and they would talk a lot about, what was going on. At some point, they had like 2 million Ukrainians in a country of like 38 million, and Poland, I mean, okay, this is sort of an on-PC topic because Poland was frequently accused of not taking immigrants, by which they mean Muslim immigrants, which is true. And I don't will not say anything beyond the fact that that was
Yeah.
the right decision to make. Look at Sweden, look at Germany, just look anywhere in Western Europe. Um, and as far as elections, we did have had this sort of right-wing leading government, kind of like in Hungary, but they lost the last parliamentary election. The turnout in the election was the highest it's ever been. It's higher than in 1989.
Wow.
The overriding issue, apparently, from the exit polls was abortion, which makes it very similar to the midterms that we had in America 2 years ago after the Supreme Court Dobbs decision, where the
Right.
turnout was very good and the Democrats did very well. and they became complacent and they thought, oh, moving to the left is actually what we want. And of course, they got clobbered this year. They misread the signals. But now we
Fair
have a
enough.
different government. We have this guy, Donald Tusk, who used to be the president of the European Commission at some point. He's like potty trained, unlike the other guys. He's actually a world leader that people respect. Because the other guys, you know about Viktor Orban because he speaks English.
Right.
His idol is Margaret Thatcher. He studied at Oxford, right? Jarosław Kaczynski, who ran the Peace Party, I mean, he's a nobody. He barely speaks Polish. If you listen to him speak Polish, he kind of lisps along. I shouldn't make fun of how people speak, but he's not presentable to Poles even, let alone, along the outside world. So you could never name who ran Poland. You could name Orban. People always could, but not the Polish guy. But they're gone now. I mean, the margin of victory was small. They're having presidential elections this year. The guy there is still the peace guy, the right wing guy, but well, he's terming out. This is his second term. He cannot run again, so they'll have to have somebody else. So this is open for debate. So that's actually Poland has turned the corner in some way, which the Hungarians have not yet. Although I think they have regressed much more in terms of propaganda and just limiting access to independent media. The Poles tried. There's this independent TV station, TVN, and the major stakeholder is Discovery Networks, which is the American conglomerate. And the government did try, the previous government did have this idea. They call it Polonizing the media. So the media should be owned by Polish people. And the Trump administration just slammed into them. I don't know what they did. I read there was some sort of a diplomatic blackmail that happened, but they reversed course so quickly. That's one instance. The other instance, I don't know if you remember, this past government passed this law that says if you're doing historical research, you are not allowed to claim that Polish people took part in the Holocaust. That participated, in, executing or enacting the Holocaust. That was a law that they passed. And again, I mean, of course, first it was Netanyahu and Israelis, of course, who were in uproar, understandably. But again, it made its way to the White House. And again, they reversed this law in one day. Lower house of parliament passes it in morning. The Senate passes it in mid-afternoon. The president was on a state visit to Latvia. He signs it digitally late afternoon, and it becomes law. It's reverted. So legislation can move very fast, actually, if you want. You can get it done in a day. If the superpower like the US steps into you. So you could say in some way that Poland also has limited sovereignty, although I know this is being biased, but America is relatively more potty trained than Poland is, relatively speaking. Not as potty trained as Canada, but more than Poland, right? So usually these influences, I think, are for the better,
Right. Do you have any thoughts on how Poland is going to be in the next couple of years? Like a stable country, still a free country, more militaristic, or what are your
um,
thoughts on Poland going into the century here?
well, the previous government has really turned the television, Polish television and radio, into a propaganda arm. I think what they did currently is they forced them into liquidation or bankruptcy. Hopefully, someone will privatize this thing. One of the biggest problems in Poland is unfinished privatization because that leads to cronyism. The previous government, they will build their power base by giving people nice gigs running, for instance, the petroleum company or some other state enterprise that exported steel or gold, coal or you name it. And of course, they had to stay loyal to this person, to the government, or else they would lose that nice little, sinecure that they had, right? So
Right.
so privatization is crucial, and I think if they privatize radio and TV, I haven't heard them talking about it, but I think that's the only way to sort of insulate yourself from the moral hazard of propaganda. And you can see here that Poland doesn't really have the culture of it. Obviously, the communists did it, but now you had the anti-communists do it too.
Right.
So Poland is not England. Polish TV is not the BBC, which even then there I hear complaints that they're left-leaning and whatnot, right? But I think people do agree that it's independent. How is the CBC viewed in Canada? Do you think it is now I'm asking you a question, but I'm just curious.
Well, yeah, that's a loaded question. It,
Okay.
it it fairly well is independent, but it does have some government. Um, the government can suggest, and the CBC we'll take that into account. They have been independent for years. I know our right-wing people who want to take over the government, they want to just quash CBC and get rid of it,
Mm.
which I don't like that idea. I like to have an independent news, but that's Canada, so it's not Poland. Zem, this has been a fascinating conversation. I have learned quite a bit, and Yankuyu, I appreciate it. Thank you very
Yeah,
much. And you
well,
take
we
care.
finally made it happen. Yep.
Okay, you
Take care.
just hold on here.